Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Pasquale Cirillo. Pasquale, please pronounce your last name.
Cirillo.
Okay, all right. So Pasquale, tell us about yourself.
I'm a statistician working in Switzerland, in Zurich. I'm professor of statistics and data science. And yeah, that's it. I've been doing a lot of things related to statistics. So I've been playing with financial data, social data in general, but also medical data. Yeah, you know, as a statistician, your job is to play with data. So it's you are quite flexible in the applications.
Yes, Pasquale, I'm familiar with your research. You have produced some really fascinating studies.
Well, thank you.
Yes, you're a very empirically rigorous guy. Many of
I
us,
hope so. I hope
yes,
so.
yes, many of us are not necessarily adept at the quantitative method, but you seem to be quite the expert. That's why you're on the show. I only interview people who can answer my questions because I pose serious questions. Now, Pasquale, we're going to be talking about the decline of violence and Steven Pinker. In one of your articles, you raise some methodological objections to Pinker's work, and I'm going to remind you of the article. The article, Pasquale, titled "The Decline of Violent Conflicts." What do the data really say? Tell us a little about this article.
Yeah, so this is the result of joint research together with Professor Nassim Taleb on this topic. We started, if I'm not wrong, in 2014. In 2014, we started working together on this data. The idea came after actually the work of Pinker, Professor Pinker, related to the decline in violence. Well, in our work, we do not speak about violence as a whole, because, you know, violence means everything and nothing. You have different manifestations of violence. And obviously in his book, Professor Pinker covers the different type of violent manifestations, from homicides to rape to wars. And what we did is actually to focus on wars and armed conflicts. That is what we did with Professor Taleb. And why did we did that? Because we started from essentially the main message of the book by Professor Pinker, which is the fact that violence is declining and we are living in a much more peaceful era. So we are living in more peaceful times with respect to what we experienced in the past as humanity. Now, our point is that, first of all, if you define violence as a whole, it is sufficient to show that one of its aspects do not decline, and then you cannot state that the whole of violence is declining. And this is why we focused on wars. And then we also agree on the fact that obviously when you speak about wars and armed conflicts in general, the number of casualties they generate because of their nature is definitely different orders of magnitude larger than other manifestations of wars. Is not to say that there is a ranking of the bad things that humans can do. This is not the purpose, but that was our choice. Also because one of these, in sociology, there are several sociologists and social scientists that essentially maintain that there is a so-called Longpiece theory, according to which essentially after World War II, that was a sort of maximum we experienced as humanity, then the world started entering in a new era of peace, or at least the great majority of countries started experiencing this new era of peaceful thoughts and livings. And this is something that we should consider as permanent. And according to Professor Pinker, but also other researchers, data support this idea. And so we can, on the basis of data, justify this idea that essentially all the bad things related to wars, or at least the worst manifestations of wars, are behind us, and that everything is progressive and improving. Our point is very simple. If you look at the data, and we looked at historical data dating back to thousands of years, obviously we had to rely upon historical reports because we were not there collecting the data, as you can imagine. What we observe in the data is that actually there is no decline, but luckily there is no increase. So the point is that looking at the data, we cannot say. So our point is we all hope for the best. So I think there is no one on earth that is actually looking towards World War III or worse. So everyone hopes that we are actually becoming less and less belligerent as a humanity, but we cannot substantiate such hope, such belief with data. We can build theories, for sure. We can try to argue that now we are richer on average, that we are much more interconnected, that we have social networks, that we have television that spread information fast, and this information that moves so quickly can, in a sense, help avoiding very problematic situations. So we can find a lot of justifications. Maybe we could say that our conversation, so this is the first time that we are speaking in person, but we already had a few exchanges after one of your articles in which you were actually supporting this idea that maybe we are less belligerent, at least in the West.
Yes.
Because we have several reasons of economic and social nature. So we are richer. We see that trade increases our wealth, our well-being, not only trade, but also diplomatic relationships, all the things together. And since we know that we live better without wars, because we have experienced this fact of living in a better situation, we don't want to go back, hopefully. And unless you are mad, you don't want to go back. And so we can justify this idea that we are in a peaceful era and that we will not be back to what we have experienced, something like 80 years ago, because World War II is something like 80 years ago. And my point is that, again, I hope this is true. I totally hope this is true. And I hope that also in other areas of the globe in which this is not true for sure, like, for example, great parts of Africa, but also Asia, I hope that this will be true for them as well. But data cannot be used to say that we read this in the data. You cannot say that for different reasons, for more or less complicated, if you want, reasons. But I would say that a very simple one is that if you look at historical data, okay, and you look, for example, at conflicts, at events, killing more than 1 million people, on average, if you look at raw data, so data that are not rescaled for the world population, on average, you have to wait something like 35 years to see such an event in the data. And the interval that you can build around that from a statistical point of view using different measures like the standard deviation or the mean absolute deviation is in the order of 50 years. So it means that 80 years are totally in line with such a number. So in principle, we are still okay. Okay, maybe it's not the right word, but we are still, in terms of data, compatible with the fact that we have not observed an event in Europe or in the US killing more than 1 million people. And if you go to 2 million people, then this threshold goes to almost 60 years. And if you go to 5 million people, you go to almost 100 years. And if you want something that is comparable to World War II, you have to wait on average 350 years or something like that. I'm going by heart, but it's 350 years more or less. So you can imagine that 80 years of peace means nothing. And this is for the raw data, but this is also true if you go to the rescaled data, because, you know, there are people that say, okay, we all believe that one death is a terrible event and a lot of people dying is a terrible event. But obviously, if you have 10 people dying, if the world population is 100 people, or you have 10 people dying, if the world population is 1 billion, the relative impact is different. So we can agree. From an ethical point of view, I do not agree, but okay, this is another reason. But let's agree that statistically, obviously, it's a different thing if you look at absolute numbers or you rescale to the world population, but the result does not change. So in our work, we have also rescaled the data and the conclusion does not change. So 80 years of relative peace that we have experienced in Europe or in the US are not sufficient to state that we are less belligerent. And it's relative, because if you think of Europe, you can immediately think of Yugoslavia. So we had wars. And if you think of the US is a special situation because the really big attack that the US experienced is essentially the 9/11 event on its own territory, but the US have been involved in several wars over the years all around the world. So in any case, it's not true that the US have not experienced war. So think of the last example, Afghanistan.
All right, so some of your work would support the contention of Professor Aaron Closet, who said, who in a previous article noted that we would need another 100 to 150 years without a major interstate war before we can argue that wars are actually becoming infrequent.
Yeah, indeed. So the point is, one thing that is in common between the work of Professor Closet and our work is that we both find this fact that if you look at the distribution of casualties in wars, this distribution is characterized by what we statisticians call a fat tail. That is to say,
Pasquale, yes. I was just about to ask you, what's the fat tail distribution? I wanted to discuss the statistical issues. You're on the ball.
Yeah, so fat tail distribution, okay. In statistics, you know that a distribution is what we use from a mathematical point of view to describe the likelihood of a given event. And distributions have several characteristics. From a distribution, you can compute the expected value, or if you want prosaically the mean of an event, you can compute variability measures like the standard deviation, the variance, or other things like that. And you can focus on a part of the distribution, that is the tail. Now, a distribution in general has a left tail, that is the part of the distribution that is related to small events. So imagine that we are looking at the distribution of war casualties. The left tail would be the part of the distribution of the graph of the distribution on the left-hand side, in which you consider those events generating a small number of victims. And then you have the right tail on the right-hand side, on which you are essentially focusing your attention on the big players. So World War II, World War I, all the Mongol invasions, or Napoleon, and all the other things like that. Now, a distribution is said to be fat-tailed if these tails, and in particular, to our interest, the right tail, it cannot be the left tail because you cannot have a negative number of casualties. So the left tail for a phenomenon like wars is essentially bounded at 0. Okay, you cannot have a negative number of people dying. So you have to go to the right-hand side, and on the right-hand side, fat tail means that the probability of very large events like World War II are larger than what will be under a so-called thin-tailed distribution, like the normal distribution, the Gaussian distribution that we all know is very popular for many phenomena. And technically speaking, fat-tailed means that if you look at the behavior of this tail from a mathematical point of view, this object decays as a power law. So it means that at a certain point, if you look at the probability that my phenomenon is above a given value x, that probability goes as x to the power minus parameter alpha that we call the tail parameter. So it's essentially a power law decay in the tail. And that's important to know that, because obviously from this fact we can derive a lot of useful results. But most of all, we know that if such a tail manifests itself, then you have to be very careful in making predictions and statements like those that Professor Pinker does. And what is funny is that in the book itself by Professor Pinker, it is said that actually we have this power law behavior, so we have fat tails. But if you know that you have fat tails, it means that the chance of very large events is not at all negligible, and that usually you have to wait a lot of time, a lot of years in our case, before looking a new realization of that magnitude. So the difference between the work of Professor Closet and our can be in saying that instead of 150 years, it is 300 years or something like that, but the substance is the same. The result is that just 80 years of relative peace are not enough to state that there is a structural change in terms of wars. So I repeat, we hope this is true, because again, I don't think that you are in favor of a lot of people dying. I'm not in favor of a lot of people dying. So we all are in favor of a wonderful progressive world in which everyone is happy. But hopes and wishes are not science.
Not at all, Pasquale. As I said earlier, I do appreciate some of Pinker's research, and in the latter segment of our conversation, I will explain in depth my position on the issue. But the thesis asserting that violence is receding is indicative of a Whiggish approach to history. Progress is likely, but not inevitable.
Yeah, I totally agree. So it makes sense that because there are many things that we have to take into consideration. First of all, when there are technical issues, but I want to tackle this point about progress that you made. So progress is for sure something that we can see as positive, because of progress and technology, a lot of people actually exited poverty. The number is increasing. So on average, at the world level, we are better and better. Less kids are dying of disease. The violence on women is declining. This is true. Already, we cannot say that homicides are essentially declining, because if you go, for example, online on the beautiful Our World in Data website from the University of Oxford, and you look, for example, at the homicide rate in the US in the last 200 years, you see that it's a wave. So it increases, it decreases, it increases, it decreases. And if you look at what is happening now, essentially, you have that, for sure, if you look back up to 20 years, it looks like it is decreasing. But if you zoom in a little bit more, then you see that before it was increasing, and then it was decreasing and increasing again. So it's a sort of wave. In other countries like Ecuador, it is definitely increasing. If you take Haiti, it's totally increasing. So, I mean, it's difficult to say that for everyone, this has been improving. And always coming back to progress, I think you agree with me that if you were an ancient Roman, okay, or an ancient Chinese warrior, or a Native American warrior, you could have been a very sophisticated and efficient warrior and killer in a battle. But I guess you will never reach the amount of casualties you can generate with one button and a nuke. So,
exactly.
So you see that progress is, for sure, it increases our well-being, but it can also generate technology that can be used for the worst, not for the best. So again, you know that during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union essentially were all playing with these menace of the nuke. And also now countries are trying to have the technology to build nukes because of the potential they have and the fact that don't mess with me because I have this guy and I can play with this guy. So, I mean, again, progress is a very nice thing. We all hope for the best. We have to struggle and we have to work for progress to be something that help us. But at the same time, there is no guarantee that we are always improving as humanity. So, and also in history, if you look back at history, we have experienced in the different parts of the world, we have experienced empires that had golden era, golden times, golden periods, followed by destruction and despair. And that has happened several times. So I don't see why, again, we hope not, but I don't see why we have the guarantee that this will not happen to us.
Pasquale, there's also another poignant issue. Progress as a paradox. Life expectancy is increasing, literacy rates are going up, and prior to COVID, poverty rates were trending down. However, progressive societies are not necessarily correlated with well-being. There is a correlation between economic freedom and well-being, but in rich societies, depression is a problem and loneliness is also a major problem. So some of Pinker's critics have argued that it is, they have argued that the thesis should actually be the anti-enlightenment era, because although financially we're better off, emotionally we're encountering innumerable problems. So progress does not always predict happiness.
No, I agree also, because I mean, progress, I mean, think of, for example, there is a very simple example, I think. If you take the US, but also if you take Europe, so if you take Japan is a little bit of a different, because, but I mean, if you take the great majority of rich societies, okay, We all agree that now the number of people that really starve is a very small percentage if you think of just 100 years ago, okay? At the same, because of progress, because we have new technology, we have new food technology, we are much more efficient, we experience a long period of peace and serenity that allowed us to build these economies that work, or at least they could work better, but for sure they work and they produce wealth, and wealth is somehow distributed and blah, 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 blah. But now we have a lot of problems with diabetes.
Yes.
So, which is a result, because now we are rich, we can eat a lot, maybe we eat too much, and then we have the problem of diabetes. I mean, and the same, I mean, also technology. We have social networks that are an extremely nice and cool mean, because we met on a social network. We have now the possibility of speaking through technology on this. Imagine doing this call something like 20 years ago. It was something that could have cost hundreds of dollars. I don't know, because I mean, it's you have to think about these kind of things. Now it's free. You can do whatever you want. But because of social networks, you have a lot of kids that suffer of depression because
of Facebook, they compare themselves to other people.
Yeah, they compare themselves to the top model of the moment, or to the very rich guy from the social networks that was lucky enough to make a few videos, become very popular, and now is a millionaire. And these kids, these teenagers, feel the competition and the pressure, and maybe they enter into depression. There are several issues that I think doctors, psychiatrists will have to study, also social scientists will have and are investigating. So again, progress can be a very nice thing, and empirically, for many reasons, is a nice thing, but it can also have downsides, and we know that. So what we can try to do as a society is to work to have more freedom, to have the possibility of minimizing the bad aspects of progress that in every case will always be there. Because I mean, the first guy that invented a knife really created something fantastic, because think about all the things that you can do with a knife. But once you have a knife, you can clean your apple, you can cut your steak, you can do what you want, but you can also cut your finger, you can kill a guy. So for everything, there are pros and cons, and it's a little bit naive to only say that there are pros.
Progress has the ripple effect of expanding human sociality and diminishing it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you think of, for example, social networks, this is actually the case. We are much more connected online, but for a lot of people, that also means being less connected in, I don't like the expression real life, because I think that also on the social networks, you have real life. It's not that it's your avatar, but let's use real life, and you have people that somehow decide to live online and less offline. So definitely, yes, you're right.
There's always a downside and an upside. Social media can ignite democratic revolutions, but on the other hand, social media may also facilitate political insularity.
Yeah, and I mean, is not, I think, a surprise that regimes all over the world are either banning social media, or they control them. Because the idea is that either you ban them, so you do not risk to have the positive side of social media for the population that for you as a regime is a bad thing, or you control them. So you create state-owned social media and state-owned WhatsApp and similar things, and you allow your citizens to only use those because you can control them. And maybe you also exploit that to collect data that you can use for other purposes. I mean, for a government, having a state-owned social media is a win-win situation. For us, it's dystopic, but for them, it's a win-win situation.
Pasquale, I submit that many of Pinker's critics are dissecting his arguments from the wrong angles. Progress is likely, but not inevitable, and I must belabor this point. So on one level, state capacity is correlated with development because the state can pacify the atrocious desires of human beings. However, excessive state capacity logically means that the state is becoming intrusive, and an intrusive state can annihilate economic freedom and progress. So many of Pinker's critics, they are not analyzing the issue from a broader perspective. They're only saying violence is not really declining, but the broader issue is how we interact with progress. What are the advantages and the disadvantages of progress? When is too much government a problem? These are the salient issues that are not discussed by many of its critics. But there's a fascinating book titled Modernity and Cultural Decline, a Biobehavioral Perspective, written by Michael Woodley of Meany, Colin Feltham, and Matthew Alexander Saroff.
Mm-hmm.
It's an excellent book, and I love the chapter on Pinker, and it is titled Enlightenment Never. There's a subtopic. I believe the subtopic is Enlightenment Never. And they're not arguing that progress is receding. Their contention is that well-being is receding and other social correlates are not heading in the right direction. So it's a more nuanced critique of Pinker's work.
Yeah, I mean, again, if I had to share the hopes of Professor Pinker, there is no discussion. I totally share his hopes. Again, because we all want a better world, a richer world in which everyone is feeling better. So there is no discussion on that. What I essentially do not agree with is, first of all, the fact that you can state that something is based on data when this is not true, because data in many situations do not allow us yet, at least, to say that there is a real decline in war casualties, that there is a decline in belligerence, that there is a decline also in our killer instincts if you think of homicides, because again, it depends a lot. And my second point is that the views of Professor Pinker in his book are too much Western-centric, and which is fine. You can for sure say that I want to analyze only the situation of the Western countries, fine, but that needs to be clearly stated, and you cannot say that because of what you observe in the US, you can extrapolate a trend for South Africa or for Rwanda or for Vietnam or for India or for Italy or for any other country. Okay, so it's either you really use world data and you try to do that, but this is really a a very big job. So it's really ambitious. But I mean, I repeat, if you go online on the Our World in Data website, I think it's a wonderful website because many of the things that you find in several books and newspaper can be easily somehow dismounted. They can be easily proven wrong by looking at trends. I mean, if you look at the homicides rates in several countries, including the US, you cannot say that in the last 80 years, in the last 100 years, they have been declining. This is not true. So we have seen periods in which they have declined. Sure, I'm not saying this is not true, but we also have seen periods in which they increased. And again, I've not studied that data in detail, so I cannot say be as, let's say, convincing as I hope I can be for wars. But my feeling is the same. So we have to wait and we have to collect data and we have to keep on studying, hoping for the best as usual, but also being neutral. Because one thing that you have to do when you analyze data is to be neutral. So you cannot, because you know that we say that with statistics, if you torture the data long enough, they will say what you want them to say, okay? Which is true. So you can always find a subset of the data that confirm your theory. But again, this is not the way it should be done.
A perfect example is the case of Sweden. Sweden has not been involved in a major war in over 200 years. Therefore, the recession of war in Sweden is not a fluke. Can we say the same for other countries? The answer is no.
Yeah, but I have another example. So let's think about terrorism, okay? Take the US. Now, the US are a very special and I think interesting situation because of geography, okay, apart from the fact that it's the #1 country in terms of military and all these kind of things. So obviously you think twice before messing with the US. This is obvious. But if you look at the US, and the US over the years have been subject to terrorist attacks. Most of them were of internal nature. Okay, and if you look at the time series of people dying because of terrorist attacks within the US, you have several events. So you have several events every year in the US because you can always consider a mass shooting as a terrorist attack. And if you use that classification, which is quite common, then you know that in the US, these events tend to happen more than in other countries, for example. But if you look at, imagine that you were the day before 9/11. Do you know what was the most violent terrorist attack in the US before 9/11?
Remind us.
It was the Oklahoma City bombing.
Okay, yes, I remember.
Of 1995 in April, if I'm right. And we are speaking about a lot of people dying because it were above 150. If I remember correctly, it was 168 people dying, which is a lot of people. 168 people dying, it's a lot of people. Yet.
But that's a minute number.
Sorry?
It's a minute number. 160 is a lot, but in the grand scheme of how we define terrorism, that's a minute number. So for most people.
No, but I mean, think of the US, it's 168 is a huge number, but then the next event, 9/11, is order of magnitudes bigger because we are speaking about almost 3,000 casualties in the two towers. So it was 2,996 or something like that. So you see that is the point of a Fattail. So if you have just look at the data until August, the August before 9/11, okay, just a few days before 9/11, you could have said, okay, the Oklahoma City bombing was a big event. It was the biggest one. The second biggest one was definitely smaller because we were below 50 people. And since 1995, nothing happened. So we can definitely say that terrorism in the US is declining and that we are likely not seeing anything else like that. And then you have 9/11. That is a plastic example of a Fattail. When you have a Fattail, you know that the maximum to date, so the biggest observation you have observed so far, is just a lower bound for the next maximum. So the next maximum will be larger. And this is something that we accept in sports, because you know that if there is a world record for a discipline, it means that the world record is the world record until there is a new world record. And in order to be the new world record, you need to be faster, you need to be stronger, you need to be to jump higher, depending on the discipline. And we all agree that the next maximum, in order to be a record, will be larger. And in in society, we tend to dismiss that. And so since we have observed an event that was large and in the last 30 years, nothing happened on that magnitude, then we say, okay, that was the maximum and we are safe.
Exactly my point again. And what's also quite intriguing is that people who usually agree with Steven Pinker, they often invoke the environment of hunter-gatherers, and they say, well, according to the data, hunter-gatherers were violent people, and they are accurate. Hunter-gatherers on average were violent. Many books have been written on the topic by people like Azar Gott and Lawrence Keeley, but they're missing a crucial element. Based on my survey of the data, prosperous hunter-gatherer societies also engaged in violence. Greek democracies, they were also violent. So again, another important matter, when does wealth really predicts a decline in violence? This is a fascinating question.
Yeah, but it's also more than that, because I mean, now, so if you look at the events of the last 100 years, but I would say the last 200 years, we tend to be relatively precise in counting the number of, you can never be precise. Okay, so let's put a caveat. You can never be precise in counting the number of casualties in an event, unless it's a specific homicide. In that case, it's easy, but for a war, you cannot state the exact number. It's essentially impossible. But let's say that we can be precise in the sense that at least the magnitude is correct. So we can, with a good approximation, distinguish between 1,000 and 2,000 casualties. But the point is that we cannot say the same of events from the past, because you know better than me that history is written by the winners. And so all the reportage, the reports, all the information about wars in the past, and think about events happening in ancient Greece or during the Roman Empire. So, I mean, we have historians that left a lot of information, but that information most of the times is blended with legend and with myth and with things like that. So and very often we inflate data from the past. I think that a very nice example that we also cite in our work are the Mongol invasions.
The Mongols.
Yeah, the Mongols. Yeah, that's the point, because I mean, we tend to say the Mongol invasions and we speak about millions of casualties. But just because we are essentially putting together a lot of smaller events, because it's not that there was one event in 1 year killing a lot of people. These are events over decades, okay, several battles. And it's obvious that if you put together several battles, you inflate. And in fact, there is also discussion about World War II. Should we consider World War II as one event, or should we distinguish between the people dying in Europe, at least from the people dying in China and Japan, and people dying in either in Northern Africa or in the Middle East and so on? Because if you start doing that, then you disaggregate data and the big event becomes the sum of several different events. And if in the past we tended to do that a lot, you can imagine that we inflated numbers from the past. So if you have very large numbers in the past, and then you look at the present, and you can naively say, okay, in the past it was a lot, now it's less, so there is a decline. But it's not correct. It is also given by the fact that there are ambiguities and problems of uncertainty in the report of the past and the way in which we also tended to collect the information from the past. By the way, there is a very nice book. So I will not, because I don't think it's appropriate, I will not cite anything else about what we did with Professor Taleb, but there is a very nice book from a scholar that I would suggest, and it's called Only the Dead. It's by Professor Bear Braumüller.
Yes, I'm familiar with him.
And that book is a very nice book on the topic of war and on the fact that actually you can see that if you clearly look at data, again, this book is not speaking about violence as a whole, it's just speaking about wars, but it is quite convincing and very well supported by data analysis, but also sociological and political discussion about the fact that, in a sense, as I said, we hope for the best, but we cannot say that we are less belligerent than in the past. In the modern era, in the modern age, war is still a persistent phenomenon.
Another person to survey is Stephen Beard. His work on warfare is also a bit compelling. Pasquale, I have a question. During my research, I attempted to ascertain data on the ability of rebel groups to wage successful wars, and I could not locate anything conclusive. Do you have data on the topic?
No.
Oh, you don't have data on the topic. Is that what you're saying?
Not specific data on the topic. It would be fascinating to look for the data. Yeah,
we have anecdotes. We don't have data, and as a researcher, I don't like to make predictions. But when we do get the appropriate data, I'm predicting that the data will reveal that on average, rebel groups are not in a capacity to wage effective wars.
I mean, to win a war, you need a lot of money.
Exactly my point.
That's the thing. War is an extremely expensive business, and in fact, you know, it's always very difficult to make this type of predictions, and I don't like to make this type of predictions, but you can, if you want, you can take that as it's a game. I'm pretty sure that if during the Cold War we would have seen a real war between the US and the Soviet Union, for sure that would have been a tragedy and in size comparable to World War II, that's or even worse, and then also the risk of nukes again, and blah blah blah. But the chances, at least in my opinion, would have been in favor of the US. The US would have paid a tremendous price in terms of casualties and all the rest, but the US were richer and probably would have been able to bear the costs of a war for a longer time than the Soviet Union. Because it's a very expensive thing. So I don't know how rebel groups, they can be successful in the how do you say, guerrilla. That's for sure, because, and they can be tiring. So if you are a government and you have these groups that are continuously attacking, even on a small scale, this is for sure tiring and consuming, but it's a different thing with respect to winning a war.
Politically connected rebel groups obviously are more successful, but when we refer to rebel groups, we're not always talking about groups like Al-Qaeda, rebel groups can refer to any loosely organized group with aims that are inconsistent with the state and are often violent. But usually when the term rebel group is envisioned in our mind, we get the impression that we're referring to a major rebel group, and this is not often the case.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, again, I cannot say, I cannot give a final
Because we don't
answer
have the
because
data.
I don't have the answer because I don't have the data, so I cannot say. But it's like, so again, that's my point. That's I tend to agree, for example, with your view, with your article about the decline in belligerence. But again, one thing is the fact that one can agree with a point of view, can agree with a theory, because I'm not saying that we cannot speculate. We can, we should speculate. I mean, if you are a social scientist, it's your job to make speculations and to try to have a credible theory about developments in society and in the different aspects of society. But what I want to underline is that you cannot say it's the data telling me that, unless you can really prove that the data is telling you that, which is not the case with war.
Not at all. Okay, let me recant a bit. I shouldn't say not at all. We're too early in the Longpiece to actually be making a case for the Longpiece.
Indeed, we have to wait. That's, I mean, probably we will not be able, the two of us, to have the final word, because the point is that we have to wait 150 to 100, 300 years. And maybe we will be there because of technology, maybe not, but given the current standards, let's say that given the current standards in medicine and aging research, it's very unlikely that I will be there in 200 years from now. So it's probably, I will not have the final answer. That's a pity, but it's, let's hope that this is true, that we are experiencing this new era of peace and serenity. But then, I mean, if you look at what is happening around, and there is also, for example, now we have seen Afghanistan, okay, and then there is also this tension in Asia between mainland China and Taiwan, and this is an area of friction. There is the big area of friction at the border with India. Africa is almost everywhere in a very unstable situation, and all in a sudden you can have problems. Also in several areas of South America, I would say that there are chances of something happening. I mean, again, I will not say that the world is a better place just because in the US or in some European country, everything was and is better than before.
And what do many of these environments have in common? I will just be honest, Pasquale. I'm a libertarian, therefore I'm not really in favor of state and state power. However, even a limited state is still a state. Many of these places that are waging continuous wars are deficient in the rule of law, and they're also diverse societies, and these diverse societies have been unable to facilitate cooperation. This is a common trend.
Yeah, I mean, there are many different reasons, because obviously yeah, these are all places in which there is no state, or there is an extremely corrupt state, which is probably worse than no state. And And moreover, I mean, there are several complex historical reasons. There is the fact that we are speaking about poor areas in which, I mean, there are situations, there are very many situations actually, in which there is no sufficient water supply. And so you can imagine that a very hot summer can create tragedies. And when you have these and you have a lot, masses of people moving because of the natural desire to survive and live a better life than the one you were assigned to in the place you were born, then these are all creators of tension and problems. And then here we enter in something which is not my field, so I'm not.
Yeah, you're
So,
not a historian.
no, and
People like
obviously
me, Pasquale, people like me, we do research, and then people like you examine the data.
my job is to look at data and
Exactly.
yeah, and to try to see if theories make sense, to try to somehow debunk if someone says that something is based on data when it is not, and to look at interesting trends in the data. But again, I repeat, there are situations in which with a few data, you can really have strong results. So if you look at the height of people, if you measure the height of people, this is a phenomenon that has very nice characteristics from a statistical point of view, in which the normal distribution can be used safely, and with a few data points, you can be relatively safe in making speculations about the height of people, the average height, the standard deviation, and things like that. The same if you look at the weight of people, the same if you look at different quantities in medicine, in biology, also in some cases in physics. But when you enter the social realm, when you enter the social data, then still there are situations in which you can be relatively safe, but it becomes more and more complex because of human behavior. And there you see that those power laws, those Fattails start appearing. And when they appear, they are very difficult to treat. I mean, if I teach at the university, okay? If I have a relatively large enough classroom, say that I have a large classroom with 200 students, if I measure their height, I can use that classroom to make a safe inference about the height of students in the country where I teach, which is Switzerland. I can probably use the data also to make inference about the US. I can use the data to make inference about the population as a whole, not just students with corrections. I can do a lot of things. But imagine that instead of the height of people, I'm measuring the wealth of those students. Now, if I'm measuring the height of students and I move from 200 students to 201 students because one enters, this guy can be very tall or can be very short, but its impact on the average height of the classroom is minimal. But if I look at wealth, that guy can totally change the game, because if that guy is Jeff Bezos,
Yes.
or someone that has the wealth of just Jeff Bezos, the average wealth I've computed in my classroom is completely destroyed and made useless in terms of inference because of the fact that one single observation can change the game, which is not something that happens with the height of people. I mean, you can be very tall, you can be 2.5 meters if you want. So you are very, very tall. You are probably one of the tallest NBA players, but still you will not be able to move substantially the average of 200 people in terms of height. If you are Jeff Bezos and you have the average of 200 people, you can definitely move the average wealth of those 200 people, even if in those 200 people you have Bill Gates. So even if you have Bill Gates, even if you have other people of that wealth, your single observation can still make have substantial impact on the rest of the data.
All right, Pasquale. So a quick rejoinder to people arguing that war is declining, and also who contend that warfare is becoming less violent. There's a paper titled Decline of War or End of Positive Check, Analysis of Change in War Size Distribution between 1816 to 2007. And I think that it is a great paper, but my views differ a bit. The states equipped to wage destructive wars do not think that warfare is feasible. So obviously, when you're doing this type of research, you must account for countries like England, Russia, China, the big states that are uninterested in pursuing warfare, because as you rightly explained earlier, warfare is expensive. And secondly, Pasquale, I'm going to give you my version for the decline of warfare in the West. Steven Pinker should revisit his book to include another chapter, or better yet, maybe Pinker's book should be titled The Great Divergence in Warfare. The issue is that IQ is correlated with pro-sociality and moral reasoning, but not necessarily moral behavior. One can reason like a moral agent, but will he act like a moral agent? This is a different issue. However, the data suggests that IQ predicts pro-sociality, human tolerance, there's been an increase in IQ, the Flynn effect. Some are arguing that the Flynn effect is being reversed, but the reality is that there was a secular increase in IQ. There was also the Enlightenment and what Norbert Elias calls the civilizing process. Societies record a decline in warfare based on the level of psychosocial development. This is my argument, and it comports with the works of an academic called George Oosterdieckhoff. He's a German academic, and I think if you're unfamiliar with his work, you should read his books and his articles. Violence is declining in places that are richer in pro-sociality and tolerance. I'm just going to be frank. Psychosocial development predicts peace. This is my own opinion.
I mean, makes sense. It makes sense.
Yes. For some, it could be controversial. For some, it could be controversial.
I'm not a great fan of IQ as a measure, but I agree that if your level of education, if your level of societal contacts, if your level of well-being in general is higher, then you tend to be against war. Also for a simple conservative motivation, which is you don't want to lose what you have. So, and you know that if there is war, maybe you have the chance to improve your condition, but very likely you have the chance of losing your condition and apart from your life. But at the same time, makes sense to reason in this way up to a certain point. But again, I don't think we have enough data for the moment to substantiate also this theory and this view, and we will have to see, because again, I repeat, we now have experienced this situation, but imagine that in 10 years from now, there is hopefully not World War III.
Yes.
That also involves the Western countries. Then, okay, what's the point?
Well, Pasquale, I'm not looking for a response now because we're wrapping up, but I'm just sharing my views and the views of George Oosterdieckhoff. So George Oosterdieckhoff contends that pre-modern man, his mentality was indicative of that of children, and furthermore, pre-modern war. Let me not say pre-modern warfare, because World War I and World War II are both reflective of the modern era, but specifically older wars in particularly World War I, George Wooster Dekoff contends that at that time, we were at a lower stage of psychosocial development. So pre-modern warfare is actually explicable by psychosocial development. It's an interesting argument. It can be tested, but we just need more quantitative and qualitative literature. Pasquale, it was a pleasure to speak to you, but unfortunately I have to wrap up. So bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right then.